اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم إني أسألك برحمتك التي وسعت كل شيء وبقوتك التي قهرت بها كل شيء وخضع لها كل شيء وذل لها كل شيء وبجبروتك التي غلبت بها كل شيء وبعزتك التي لا يقوم لها شيء وبعظمتك التي ملأت كل شيء وبسلطانك الذي على كل شيء وبوجهك الباقي بعد فناء كل شيء وبأسمائك التي ملأت أركان كل شيء وبعلمك الذي أحاط بكل شيء وبنور وجهك الذي أضاء له كل شيء. يا نور يا قدوس، يا نور يا قدوس، يا نور يا قدوس، يا أول الأولين ويا آخر الآخرين. اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تهتك العصام، اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تنزل النقام، اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تغير النعم، اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تحبس الدعاء، اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تنزل البلاء. اللهم اغفر لي كل ذنب أذنبته وكل خطيئة أخطأتها. اللهم إني أتقرب إليك بذكرك وأستشفع بك إلى نفسك وأسألك بجودك أن تدنيني من قربك وأن توزعني شكرك وأن تلهمني ذكرك. اللهم إني أسألك سؤال خاضع متذلل خاشع أن تسامحني وترحمني وتجعلني بقسمك راضيا قانعا وفي جميع الأحوال متواضعا. اللهم وأسألك سؤال من اشتدت فاقته وأنزل بك عند الشدائد حاجته وعظم فيما عندك رغبته. اللهم عظم سلطانك وعلى مكانك وخفي مكرك وظهر أمرك وغلب قهرك وجرت قدرتك ولا يمكن الفرار من حكومتك. اللهم لا أجد لذنوبي غافرا ولا لقبائحي ساترا ولا لشيء من عملي القبيح بالحسن مبدلا غيرك. لا إله إلا أنت سبحانك وبحمدك. ظلمت نفسي ظلمت نفسي ظلمت نفسي وتجرأت بجهلي وسكنت إلى قديم ذكرك لي ومنك علي. اللهم مولاي كم من قبيح سترته وكم من فادح من البلاء أقلته وكم من عثار وقيته وكم من مكروه دفعته وكم من ثناء جميل لست أهلا له نشرته. اللهم عظم بلائي وأفرط بي سوء حالي وقصرت بي أعمالي وقعدت بي أغلالي وحبسني عن نفعي بعد أملي وخدعتني الدنيا بغرورها ونفسي بجنايتها ومطالي يا سيدي. فأسألك بعزتك ألا يحجب عنك دعائي سوء عملي وفعالي ولا تفضحني بخفي ما اطلعت عليه من سري ولا تعاجلني بالعقوبة على ما عملته في خلواتي. من سوء فعلي وإساءتي ودوام تفريطي وجهالتي وكثرة شهواتي وغفلتي. وكن اللهم بعزتك لي في كل الأحوال رؤوفا، وعلي في جميع الأمور عطوفا. إلهي وربي من لي غيرك، أسأله كشف ضري والنظر في أمري. إلهي ومولاي أجريت علي حكما اتبعت فيه هوى نفسي، ولم أحترس فيه من تزيين عدوي، فغرني بما أهوى وأسعده على ذلك القضاء، فتجاوزت بما جرى علي من ذلك بعد حدودك، وخالفت بعد أوامرك. فلك الحجة علي في جميع ذلك، ولا حجة لي فيما جرى علي فيه قضاؤك، وألزمني حكمك وبلاؤك. وقد أتيتك يا إلهي بعد تقصيري وإسرافي على نفسي، معتذرا نادما منكسرا مستقيلا مستغفرا منيبا مقرا مذعنا معترفا. لا أجد مفرا مما كان مني، ولا مفزعا أتوجه إليه في أمري، غير قبولك عذري وإدخالك إياي في سعة من رحمتك. اللهم فاقبل عذري، وارحم شدة ضري، وفكني من شدي وثاقي. يا رب ارحم ضعف بدني، يا رب ارحم ضعف بدني، يا رب ارحم ضعف بدني، ورقة جلدي ودقة عظمي. يا من بدأ خلقي وذكري وتربيتي وبري وتغذيتي، هبني لابتداء كرمك وسالف برك بي. يا إلهي وسيدي وربي، أتراك معذبي بنارك بعد توحيدك، وبعد من طوى عليه قلبي من معرفتك، ولهج به لساني من ذكرك، واعتقده ضميري من حبك، وبعد صدق اعترافي ودعائي خاضعا لربوبيتك. هيهات أنت أكرم من أن تضيع من ربيته، أو تبعد من أدنيته، أو تشرد من آويته، أو تسلم إلى البلاء من كفيته ورحمته. وليت شعري يا سيدي وإلهي ومولاي، أتسلط النار على وجوه خرت لعظمتك ساجدة، وعلى ألسن نطقت بتوحيدك صادقة، وبشكرك مادحة، وعلى قلوب اعترفت بإلهيتك محققة، وعلى ضمائر حوات من العلم بك حتى صارت خاشعة، وعلى جوارح سعات إلى أوطان تعبدك طائعة، وأشارت باستغفارك مذعنة. ما هكذا الظن بك، ولا أخبرنا بفضلك عنك. يا كريم يا رب، يا كريم يا رب، يا كريم يا رب. وأنت تعلم ضعفي عن قليل من بلاء الدنيا وعقوباتها، وما يجري فيها من المكاره على أهلها، على أن ذلك بلاء ومكروه، قليل مكثوه، يسير بقاؤه، قصير مدته. فكيف احتمالي لبلاء الآخرة وجليل وقوع المكاره فيها، وهو بلاء تطول مدته ويدوم مقامه، ولا يخفف عن أهله، لأنه لا يكون إلا عن غضبك وانتقامك وسخطك، وهذا ما لا تقوم له السماوات والأرض. يا سيدي فكيف بي وأنا عبدك الضعيف الذليل الحقير المسكين المستكين. يا إلهي وربي وسيدي ومولاي، لأي الأمور إليك أشكو، ولما منها أضج وأبكي؟ لأليم العذاب وشدته، أم لطول البلاء ومدته؟ فلئن صيرتني للعقوبات مع أعدائك، وجمعت بيني وبين أهل بلائك، وفرقت بيني وبين أحبائك وأوليائك، فهبني يا إلهي وسيدي ومولاي وربي. صبرت على عذابك، فكيف أصبر على فراقك؟ وهبني صبرت على حر نارك، فكيف أصبر عن النظر إلى كرامتك؟ أم كيف أسكن في النار ورجائي عفوك؟ فبعزتك يا سيدي ومولاي أقسم صادقا، لئن تركتني ناطقا لأضجن إليك بين أهلها ضجيج الآمنين، ولأصرخن إليك صراخ المستصرخين، ولأبكين عليك بكاء الفاقدين، ولأنادينك أين كنت يا ولي المؤمنين؟ يا غاية آمال العارفين، يا غياث المستغيثين، يا غياث المستغيثين، يا غياث المستغيثين، يا حبيب قلوب الصادقين، ويا إله العالمين. أفتراك سبحانك يا إلهي وبحمدك تسمع فيها صوت عبد مسلم سجن فيها بمخالفته، وذاق طعم عذابها بمعصيته، وحبس بين أطباقها بجرمه وجريرته، وهو يضج إليك ضجيج مؤمل لرحمتك، ويناديك بلسان أهل توحيدك، ويتوسل إليك بربوبيتك. يا مولاي فكيف يبقى في العذاب وهو يرجو ما سلف من حلمك؟ أم كيف تؤلمه النار وهو يأمل فضلك ورحمتك؟ أم كيف يحرقه لهيبها وأنت تسمع صوته وترى مكانه؟ أم كيف يشتمل عليه زفيرها وأنت تعلم ضعفه؟ أم كيف يتقلقل بين أطباقها وأنت تعلم صدقه؟ أم كيف تزجره زبانيتها وهو يناديك يا ربه؟ أم كيف يرجو فضلك في عتقه منها فتتركه فيها؟ هيهات ما ذلك الظن بك، ولا المعروف من فضلك، ولا مشبه لما عاملت به الموحدين من برك وإحسانك. فباليقين أقطع لولا ما حكمت به من تعذيب جاحديك، وقضيت به من إخلال معانديك، لجعلت النار كلها بردا وسلاما، وما كانت لأحد فيها مقرا ولا مقاما. لكنك تقدست أسماؤك، أقسمت أن تملأها من الكافرين من الجنة والناس أجمعين، وأن تخلد فيها المعاندين. وأنت جل ثناؤك قلت مبتدئا وتطولت بالإنعام متكرما: أفمن كان مؤمنا كمن كان فاسقا لا يستوون. إلهي وسيدي، فأسألك بالقدرة التي قدرتها وبالقضية التي حتمتها وحكمتها وغلبت من عليه أجريتها، أن تهب لي في هذه الليلة وفي هذه الساعة كل جرم أجرمته وكل ذنب أذنبته وكل قبيح أسررته وكل جهل عملته، كتمته أو أعلنته، أخفيته أو أظهرته، وكل سيئة أمرت بإثباتها الكرام الكاتبين الذين وكلتهم بحفظ ما يكون مني وجعلتهم شهودا علي مع جوارحي، وكنت أنت الرقيب علي من ورائهم والشاهد لما خفي عنهم، وبرحمتك أخفيته وبفضلك سترته، وأن توفر حظي من كل خير أنزلته أو إحسان فضلته أو بر نشرته أو رزق بسطته أو ذنب تغفره أو خطأ تستره. يا ربي يا ربي يا رب، يا ربي يا ربي يا رب، يا ربي يا ربي يا رب، يا إلهي وسيدي ومولاي ومالك رقي، يا من بيده ناصيتي، يا عليما بضري ومسكنتي، يا خبيرا بفقري وفاقتي، يا ربي يا ربي يا رب، يا ربي يا ربي يا رب، يا ربي يا ربي يا رب، أسألك بحقك وقدسك وأعظم صفاتك وأسمائك أن تجعل أوقاتي من الليل والنهار بذكرك معمورة وبخدمتك موصولة وأعمالي عندك مقبولة، حتى تكون أعمالي وأورادي كلها وردا واحدا، وحالي في خدمتك سرمدا. يا سيدي يا من عليه معولي، يا من إليه شكوت أحوالي، يا ربي يا ربي يا رب، يا ربي يا ربي يا رب، يا ربي يا ربي يا رب، قو على خدمتك جوارحي واشدد على العزيمة جوانحي، وهب لي الجد في خشيتك والدوام في الاتصال بخدمتك، حتى أسرح إليك في ميادين السابقين وأسرع إليك في البارزين، وأشتاق إلى قربك في المشتاقين، وأدنو منك دنو المخلصين، وأخافك مخافة الموقنين، وأجتمع في جوارك مع المؤمنين. اللهم ومن أرادني بسوء فأرده، ومن كادني فكده، واجعلني من أحسن عبيدك نصيبا عندك، وأقربهم منزلة منك، وأخصهم زلفة لديك، فإنه لا ينال ذلك إلا بفضلك، وجد لي بجودك، وعطف علي بمجدك، واحفظني برحمتك، واجعل لساني بذكرك لهجا، وقلبي بحبك متيما، ومن علي بحسن إجابتك، وأقلني عثرتي واغفر زلتي، فإنك قضيت على عبادك بعبادتك وأمرتهم بدعائك وضمنت لهم الإجابة. فإليك يا ربي نصبت وجهي وإليك يا ربي مددت يدي، فبعزتك استجب لي دعائي وبلغني مناي ولا تقطع من فضلك رجائي، واكفني شر الجن والإنس من أعدائي. يا سريع الرضا، يا سريع الرضا، يا سريع الرضا، اغفر لمن لا يملك إلا الدعاء، فإنك فعال لما تشاء. يا من اسمه دواء وذكره شفاء وطاعته غنى، ارحم من رأس ماله الرجاء وسلاحه البكاء. يا سابغ النعم، يا دافع النقام، يا نور المستوحشين في الظلام، يا عالما لا يعلم، صل على محمد وآل محمد وافعل بما أنت أهله. وصلى الله على رسوله والأئمة الميامين من آله وسلم تسليما كثيرا كثيرا. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله الطاهرين. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم. So today we want to, now that we're done with those main discussions of the Sunnah and the Hadith and the Khabar Wahid and all that stuff that we talked about, although we just scratched the surface, we didn't really go into all the details that are out there. But I think that's enough for us to get an understanding of what a mujtahid has to deal with. Some of the things that the mujtahid has to deal with when he's doing his ijtihad. Now, what we want to do now is gain a familiarity with our main hadith sources that we have in fiqh that mujtahids use. Now, for that, we are going to have two. We're going to have two types of or categories of hadith collections that the mujtahidin use. Hopefully, in this session, we can go through the first category. What are they? These are your early / primary hadith collections, compiled by the first three Muhammads, they call them. Okay? The first three Muhammads, al-Muhammadun al-Thalath, al-Awwal, I would say. So, who are these three? Well, they are Muhammad bin Ya'qub al-Kulayni. This is the al-Kafi. And we'll talk about each of these separately. You have Muhammad bin Ali bin Babawayh, which is Shaykh al-Saduq. Or maybe that's his dad. I have to check this. Muhammad ibn Ali, ibn Hussein ibn Babawayh. So this is Shaykh al-Saduq. He has a book called Man La Yahduruhu al-Faqih. Then you have Tahdhib al-Ahkam by Muhammad bin Hassan Shaykh al-Tusi. So all of their names are Muhammad. And then you have Al-Istibsar. Now I wrote the short version of the title here, but Al-Istibsar fi makhtulifa or fi makhtalafa min al-akhbar. And that's also by Shaykh Tusi. So we have 4 main hadith books, brothers and sisters. Like, this is what a Shia is expected of a Shia to know. At least these 4 books. The 4 books, the names at least. Now the thing is that these are not, if someone comes up to you and says, oh, what are the Shia books? What are your main Shia, what are your main hadith books? These are going to be mostly hadith books that are fiqhi ones, other than the first one. Al-Kafi is fiqh and non-fiqh. We'll talk about it when we get there. Other than that, though, it's mostly fiqhi. So it's true that we have 4 main hadith collections that are early primary sources that were compiled. But we have to understand that what really shapes Shi'ism and gives us our identity is Al-Kafi. Okay? That's the main one. Although you will find a lot of nice little nuggets and gems throughout the other 3 books as well, that might also help in molding our identity. But the main one is Al-Kafi. And we'll talk about why that's the case in a little bit. So that's the first set of hadith collections that the Shia have. Why do I call them early and primary? Well, early obviously because each of these individuals who was involved in the compilation of these sources was either in the 4th or the 5th century. Shaykh al-Kulayni, for example, he died 329 AH. What else happened on 329 AH? Does anyone know? That is when the Ghaybatul Sughra ended and Ghaybatul Kubra began. Although his death has nothing to do with that, but so 328, 329, they say he passed away. So that's the 4th century after Hijrah, and that's the Ghaybatul Sughra, time of Ghaybatul Sughra, which is connected to the time of the Imams before that. So it's very close to the time of the Imams. Man La Yahduru al-Faqih was by Shaykh al-Saduq. He died in 381. So once again, 4th century, right? Shaykh Tusi is in the 5th century. But still, he's way back. This is like 1,000 years ago. Yeah? So these are early. That's why we call them early ones. But why are they primary? Because these are going to be based on no other hadith books or collections, They will be based on certain things that we've talked about before, those usul, the usul arba'mi'ah that we talked about before. We'll talk about more about them today as well. So if there are any other collections that come later in the 10th, 11th century, these are not seen as primary anymore. These are secondary. That's my term that I'm using. Secondary in the sense that they're based on other earlier sources. Okay? And just someone going there and selecting from one of these 4 that we just talked about. Okay? So we'll talk about that later though. The secondary ones. What are they? The secondary hadith collections, the ones that were compiled later by the later 3 Muhammads. So we have the first 3 Muhammads, and then we have the later 3 Muhammads. These are also, all of them, their name is Muhammad. So Al-Wafi is by Mullah Muhammad Muhsin Faid Al-Kashani, very famous. Wasa'il al-Shia, it's a hadith collection, huge. And it's by Muhammad bin Hassan al-Hurr al-Amili. So these guys, Al-Wafi, Mullah Muhsin Faith, he died in 1090 AH. That's 11th century. You see? There's a big gap here between these and the first set of collections. Wasa'il al-Shi'a by Hur Amili, he died in the 12th century, 1104 AH. Early 12th century he died. Bihar al-Anwar, Majlisi, 1110, his death is recorded. All right, so he's also early 12th century. So now Bihar, of course, is going to be one that also encompasses everything. We've all heard about Bihar al-Anwar. It's not just fiqhi, but the other ones, they're all fiqhi, really. So Al-Kafi, I would say, and Bihar, these are going to be more than just fiqh. Other than that, everything's fiqhi. The do's and don'ts, that's what it is. We'll talk about this set of, this secondary set of collections later, inshallah. What we want to do in this session is just go through, hopefully, go through these early/primary hadith collections compiled by those first three Muhammads. So let's go to Al-Kafi, the first one. Al-Kafi, and I brought the parts of the prefaces or the introductions of these books so we can read off of them just so we get an idea of the context of then. And sometimes when you read it, you're like, wow, look at that. These people were normal humans just like all of us. It's not like they came from some other world and they put together hadith books. No, they had the same struggles, they had the same issues 1,000 or 1,100 years ago. So, Al-Kafi, you would think that the people of that time, the Ghaybat al-Sughra, for example, or a little bit post Ghaybat al-Sughra, they won't deal with issues when it comes to religion and understanding the religion and being confused about the religion. You would think that they don't have any issue. Now, 1,400 years later, we're the ones who are dealing with issues. But no, the shubuhat and the challenges were there even back in then. So Al-Kafi was written. Why was it written? The most important, the most reputable and credible source of our hadith. Why was it written and compiled? Why? Well, let's read. In the introduction, he says, thereafter I say the following. I have understood, my brother, that of which you have complained to me. So Muhammad bin Yaqub al-Kulayni gets a letter from somebody, now he's responding to that letter. So think about it. All of Al-Kafi is based on and is a result of someone writing a letter to their prominent sheikh of their time. That's the job of these scholars, is to see and try to identify what the need is and address that need. So he got a letter, dedicated 20 years of his life to this book. I have understood, my brother, he says, that of which you have complained to me, that the people of our time have joined hands in the cause of ignorance and have endeavored to pave the paths that leads to it. You would think they're talking about the 21st century. No. That they have distanced themselves from knowledge and scholars to such an extent that knowledge in its entirety has nearly dried up and been cut off from its source. Kulayni, I wish you were here today. I wish you were here today to see how much things... You're telling me it's drying up back then? When you're that close to the time of the Imams? Welcome to the 21st century. For people are content to rely on ignorance and to let knowledge and scholars waste away. You mentioned that some issues are unclear to you, that you do not know the truth concerning them for the disparity in the traditions about them. He says, you're confused because you're telling me the hadiths have disparity. There's discrepancies. There's contradiction between the hadiths. That's why you're confused. That you know that the disparity in the traditions about them is for various reasons. You know that there's ikhtilaf in hadith, there's discrepancies, there's a reason for that. And that we can figure out which ones we're supposed to rely on. Just because they're conflicting doesn't mean we throw everything away. You said you know that, but you do not have anyone at hand whose knowledge of these things you can trust and with whom you can discuss these things. So think about it, just like us. We hear a hadith on one side and then we hear a hadith that conflicts with that hadith. We don't know what to do with them. The people back then had the same problem. And so he's coming to Kulayni, he says, I need somebody for this. You said that you would love to have a sufficient book, Kitabun Kafin. So this is where the title of the book comes from. A book that suffices, that's enough for you, that can help you. Kitabun Kafin. So they say that Kulayni didn't even put that name on this book, by the way. It's just it's inspired from this muqaddimah, that's preface that he has here. That's from what I remember. Yeah. So Kitabun Kafin, containing enough for the disciple, from which to seek knowledge of the religion and from which thou, I don't know what I wrote here, seek knowledge of the religion and want to act on it, from which those who seek knowledge, that's what it should be probably, from which those who seek knowledge of the religion and want to act on it can draw authentic traditions from the truthful imams. You want a book that you can get reliable hadiths from. Gotcha. You also said, if this could be, I hope it could be a means by whose help and through whose compilation God fortifies our brothers in faith and leads them to guidance. So I'm asking you for a book, but when I'm asking you for a book, it's not just for me. Hopefully, the hope is that in the future, our brethren, our Muslim brothers, our Shia brothers and sisters can benefit from such a book. Well, guess what? 1100 years later, we're still benefiting from this. Look at that sadaqah jariyah that Kulaini planted for himself. He didn't know that 1100 years later, we're going to be still going to this book. He didn't know that after him and a few others, then these main sources that he's going to be using to put together Al-Kafi, that these are going to go away. These are going to be destroyed and we won't have access to them anymore. Only his book is going to remain, which reflects what those initial sources had. Right? But yeah, he was able to, through his book and doing such a good job with his book, he was able to plant that seed that from which this tree has grown today. Yeah. Otherwise, the sources he used, they're almost all gone. We don't have access to those anymore. So let's get into some of the points that we have in regards to this book. Al-Kafi, as I said, 20 years to compile. 20 years of his life he spent on something that he felt was a need for the ummah in his time, his context. He put together Al-Kafi. He says in the introduction that these hadiths are all sahih in my eyes. Okay? This is important. I've alluded to this before as well. Sahih has an older usage and a newer usage. Sahih, they call it qudama'i, is that sahih, that usage of sahih doesn't mean that the chain of narrators necessarily always checks the boxes. No. Sahih back then had a different usage. It meant that for me, I'm getting it from sources that I'm sure these sources are reliable. I don't care about the chain too much. Although the chain is important, but it's coming from a reliable source at the end of the day. It's in a notebook that I know this notebook comes from someone that knows what they're doing. Sahih back then meant that. Nowadays though, and we talked about this in depth before, Sahih, post Allama Hilli and those ones, Sahih means that the chain of narrators is all made up of who? Reliable Shia, Ithna Ashari narrators that don't lie. Things like that. Okay? Trustworthy ones that are thiqah. We talked about this in the past. I don't want to get back into it. But he says they're all sahih in my eyes. I just wanted to point out that sahih for him means something different than for us, although it still has a high value. Yes. Very good question. So the brother's asking, each of these scholars that compiled these hadith collections, were they the most prominent of their time? Were they the most outstanding of their time? And the answer is absolutely yes. Yes. Kulaini, if you read up on him, I mean, when you read what the others of his contemporaries, those who came after him, who do biographies and bibliographies and whatnot, when they speak of him, they say, like, this guy was unmatched. This person was the top of his time and so on, yeah. And you can tell from his work that it was such, yeah. No, it wasn't. It wasn't like Allama Tabatabai, where although he was a huge figure, yet there were others who might have had some issues, like Ayatollah Burujerdi might have had some issues with him and so on. Although there are some details there. Was it Ayatollah Burujerdi who had personal issues, or no? It was just that he felt that some things are better left and not touched, things like that. But anyway, yeah, no, I've never seen anyone stand up next to Kulaini, for example, in his time. Or for example, Shaykh al-Saduq, Later on, his students might have been critical of certain beliefs that he had or certain approaches he might have had to theology and other things. But in his time, no. Like Sheikh Saduq is one of the top ones. You don't find, I don't remember anyone attacking Sheikh Saduq or, in his time or like trying to stop him from doing what he's doing. No, not necessarily. I mean, in Saduq's time is a little different, but Kulayni's time, for sure, I've never heard that anyone, was there next to him. And then At-Tusi, same thing. Like Sheikh At-Tusi, I mean, the most prominent of his time, like no doubt. And inshallah, once we get into the different eras of these fuqaha, you'll see that Tusi wasn't just Tusi. Tusi was an era. He wasn't just a person. That for decades upon decades, for like a century or more, people wouldn't dare speak against what he had said even. To that extent, he was prominent. Yeah. So in this book of Al-Kafi, what does he do? Al-Kulayni brings the sanad and chain of narrators for every hadith completely. Why do I say that? Because when we look into other collections later, they're not bringing the whole sanad. They're doing some other things. We'll get to that. Al-Kafi, unmatched, but not perfect. We said, according to him, they're all sahih. But according to him, sahih doesn't mean binding on everybody else. He's not a ma'soom. So we will still look at these hadiths with the critical eye. Yeah. So my strong guess is that this is different than Sahih al-Bukhari for Ahl Sunnah. The way they look at that, they call it Sahih al-Bukhari. We don't call this Sahih al-Kafi. We call this Usul al-Kafi, Furu' al-Kafi, Rawdat al-Kafi. We'll get to that. That's about it. We don't say everything in here is Sahih or this is the most Sahih book after the Book of Allah. We don't use that terminology. Although this is the first book we go to, yet we will go to everything and have a little grain of salt next to it. Yeah. Now there are some who will believe that no, they will have a Sahih Bukhari type of approach to this book, if that's the right way to say it. People like Al-Astarabadi, who was the head of the Akhbari school. We'll have to see, inshallah, sometime we'll talk about the Akhbaris in more detail. But he, for example, they say that he would say that, no, everything in Al-Kafi has to be accepted. Things like that. But no, other than the Akhbari school, you won't find really too many who will look at Al-Kafi as if it's untouchable. Yeah. Now, the question is this. Kulayni, you didn't live during the time of the Imams. You lived in the time of Ghaiba. Good for you. You were in the Ghaibat al-Sughra, and they say that he had met all of the, what do they call them? The Nawab and the deputies of Sahib al-Zaman in the time of Ghaibat al-Sughra, all four of them. But he never met an Imam. So when we look in Al-Kafi and you're narrating from Imam al-Sadiq and Imam al-Baqir, where did you get that from? And so this is where what I said, kind of comes back. And what a great thing he did was, he would go to the main usul, we call them, usul arba'mi'ah, the ones that we talked about before. Those notebooks, we call them, or I call them at least, that were written by companions of the Imams themselves. Like, think about it. You have a notebook from somebody who actually was sitting in the presence of Imam al-Sadiq and writing down whatever questions people were asking him, and he was answering. He would write it down in his notebook. So to get your hands on a manuscript like that, or something that has reached you through the transmission of hadiths and the system that they had in the past, of how I would write down what the Imam says, someone else would write off of my notebook, and I would look at it and I'd say, good job, you did the right, you copied it right. And that person would give it to somebody else, or read it to someone else, and the other person would write off of that. This transmission, these chains that we have, yes, this is called tahammul al-hadith, it's called, and how to transmit and to receive hadith. He has access to these early raw sources. Yeah? So there would be a person by the name of, for example, Hussein bin Sa'id al-Ahwazi. He has his manuscripts, and he has written from the later Imams. Okay, very nice. Hussein bin Sa'id, his notebook now, either the manuscript of it or the manuscript of someone who wrote off of his manuscript is in the hands of who? Al-Kulayni. So he has a good library, it seems, of these. These manuscripts, we don't have them anymore. These notebooks, these usul arba'mi'ah, we don't have them anymore. And when you look in them, we have some of them, maybe 10, 15, 20 of them max. They say that might be accessible, you might find here and there. Other than that, 400, you don't have that anymore. And in these notebooks, they were all over the place. One person asked about Hajj, one person asked about akhlaq, another person asked about this, another about that, salat, fasting. And this person's just writing whatever's being said. Kulaini, what his job is, he brings all these notebooks now, he categorizes them. That's why it's super organized, his book. That's one of the secrets, I would say, of his success, Kulaini's success. That he took all of this raw information, compiled it, organized it, categorized it, subcategories. Everything is beautifully categorized. That's one thing that really stands out about his book versus a lot of other books. They say the organization in it. Yeah? So through his organization, people are like, you know what? We have let's call it a handbook here. I don't need to go and copy or photocopy, back then, however they would photocopy, they would, transcribe 400 notebooks and then have to navigate through them. Here is a proper, organized, clean, shusterufte book that I can use. And so then Kulaini's book started getting transcribed. Brothers and sisters, this is how you lose information. When a book, back then there was no photocopy machines, right? No copy machines. So what would they do? They would transcribe. It has to be worth it for you to transcribe 400 pages, man. So I'm not going to go now to notebooks that are all over the place. I'm going to look at this handbook, so-called handbook, and I'm going to write off of this. So there's more and more copies now circulating of Al-Kafi. Those notebooks slowly are forgotten, and they slowly are destroyed. Yeah? So now Al-Kafi is the reflection of what's in those main, original, raw sources. The usul, we call them. So it was because of his organization that all of this is preserved. Now this Al-Kafi, as I said, it's not just fiqh. You have usulul kafi, which is, our beliefs. And the majority of that will go to Al-Kitab al-Hujjah, when he talks about the imams and how the imams are and all of that. But there's a lot about tawheed there. There's a lot about other things there we don't want to get into. The furu', and that's usually 2 volumes out of the 8 volumes of this book. Then you have the next 5 volumes of this book. These are the furu' of Kafi. Furu' means not the usul, but the do's and don'ts, the wajib and haram. So that's where the mujtahideen come in. The mujtahideen and the maraji', when they want to issue fatwas, they issue them based on these 5 volumes. And it starts from tahara and najasa all the way to, diyat and blood money and those things. Yeah? So all of these hadiths, you have a full fiqh here, a collection of fiqh hadiths from the beginning of fiqh to the end of fiqh in Furu'ul Kafi. Then there's that last volume, the miscellaneous, where he will put some things there, that are not related to fiqh or aqa'id necessarily, maybe some aqa'id there too, but there's a lot of different things there. Some have even argued that this might not even be his work, but when you look at the chains of narrators that he's bringing, there's an overlap. You'll find the same patterns that he has there in the previous volume. So a lot of people, I would say majority of scholars believe that this is from him for sure, but it's not the ones that he necessarily sees as reliable. And so those ones you have to take it with more salt, with more, not just a grain of salt, but grains of salt sometimes. That's where sometimes certain stories that you will hear in lectures and so on, that sometimes might raise your eyebrows a little bit, they'll come from there. There are some, and so on. So yes. Right. Yes. So the brother asks, is that how do we know? Does Kulaini let us know what his criteria was when he was selecting these hadiths? And usually it's very clear and obvious what it was. And he says it in the introduction as well, that I've gotten this from the usul. For them, if it's from the usul, doesn't go against the Quran, things like that, and is compatible with other teachings that we have, that's enough for them to say this is sahih. And hujjah between me and my Lord. I'm just letting you know that these are the ones that I choose. Oh, whoever it was who came to him and asked for this book, you're coming to me and asking me that there's conflicting hadiths, you don't know which ones to choose. I'll let you know which ones I feel are hujjah between me and Allah. What's your criteria for it? Because it's in the main sources. The ones that from the people that we know are reliable people that wrote from the Imams themselves. Now, these usul arba'miya that I mentioned, I said that usually that they've listened to the Imam and wrote down in those notebooks. Sometimes that's the definition of it. Some have another definition of usul arba'miya. They say it's not just when you hear from the Imam and you write it down. Sometimes you hear from the Imam and you write it down. Yes, that's one example. Another example of it is that when someone gets it from someone who heard it from the Imam directly. So that also, some refer to that as also usul. But anything more than that, no, it's not usul anymore. He says, I'm getting it from the main material that we know is there and is reliable. And that's why for me, between me and Allah, these are hujjah. Like, he doesn't speak about chains of narrators there. He doesn't bring that up. But you can tell, I just want to say this because some people, they're like, see, so we don't need to look at the chain. The answer is, well, then why did he bring the chain of narrators in the book then? That shows that there is value there. There is value in bringing the chain. You can't not bring the chain. But at the same time, for him, it's saying it's located in those main books as well. Okay? That's my main criteria. And so there's different ways of numbering these hadiths. Sometimes they're repetitions and so on. But one numbering says that there's almost 17 or 16,100, 16,099 hadiths in there. I've seen other numbers, 16,200. There's different ways that you can count these hadiths. But what's interesting is that just Al-Kafi in its 8 volumes, from Usul al-Kafi to Furu' to Rawda meaning that miscellaneous one, this number is more than all 6 of the Sihah al-Sitta of Ahl Sunnah. So we have a lot of hadiths here. Someone might say, oh, why is that the case? Someone might call us out as Shia and say, look, it's obvious. Look at us, we have 6 books. All together, one of your books has more hadiths than us. Obviously, it's fabricated. The answer will be no. Look, it's an epistemological discussion after that. Where do we get our knowledge from? Where do you get your knowledge from? You say you only get from Rasulullah, so obviously, you're going to have less hadiths. But we get from 12 or 14 others, 13 others we can get. Yeah? We won't have too many hadiths by Fatima Zahra. We won't have too many hadiths by Imam Mahdi alayhi salam, obviously. But at the end of the day, we have 13 more people to get hadiths from. Right? And most of them will be from Imam as-Sadiq alayhi salam. So that's why it's more. Obviously, it's going to be much more. Yes. Yeah. So if you take into consideration the repeated ones, I guess those who have numbered them more, who have a higher number than this, they're taking that into consideration. My guess is that this number is the number without the repeated ones. That's my guess. Now we do have something here. Some argue that Al-Kafi, everything has to be accepted by it. Why? How dare anybody, look at it with a critical eye? What's your reason for that, mister? They'll say that, well, Kulaini lived during the time of Ghibat al-Sughra. That means Imam Zaman is accessible at the end of the day, right? If he's accessible through the Nawab, don't you think that he would have run this book by the 12th Imam through them? Yeah? And so that's an argument that some present, that look, the 12th Imam has seen this book. But the answer to that is that there is absolutely no proof and no claim by anyone, including himself, that such a thing has happened. Yeah, for a Shia today, living 1400, 1200 years, 1100 years later, I'm like, man, if I was living in the Ghibat al-Zughra time and I wrote a book like this, I would definitely run it by Sahib al-Zaman through the Nawab. But back then, I think they didn't look at things. They didn't know that this is going to continue for 1200 years. Like there was no number. Now we know, wow, it's been 1200 years, man, or 1100 years. That's a lot. So back then, whatever it was, it's interesting. This is very interesting, by the way. Forget about this thing that I just said about, they might have not thought it was going to be this long of a ghaiba. Still, you're in Ghaibat al-Sughra time, you have the Nawab, you have access to them. Why don't you run it by the Imam? It just shows that the approach of the Imams was well established. That culture of transmission of hadith was well established, and we've talked about this before, that the Imams had taught the people that, look, this is how you transmit knowledge. You don't have to run everything by us. There's a system in place. There's reliable narrators. Go to ruwat ahadithina. Go to the ones who narrate our hadith. You don't have to knock on our door all the time. And so he put this book together. And so there is no proof. Don't you think that Al-Kulaini himself would have brought it up in his introduction if he had done such a thing? Why does he have to say, these are sahih between me and Allah? These are sahih because Taib al-Zaman said they're sahih. Finished. Yeah. So we don't have any proof for that. So that is Al-Kafi. Yes. 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 You see? These Nawab Arba'a, these 4 deputies, yeah, they're very prominent figures themselves, obviously. They're some of the greatest, but they didn't put together a work like Al-Kulaini's. Kulaini did the scholarship, he did the work, he was able to do the work. Maybe they had to be careful, these deputies, and not do something like this actually, so that they're not identified, but someone like Kulaini does it. You see, this is why I say, putting ourselves in that context, reading these prefaces to these books, gives us an idea of the context and humanizes everything for us and these people for us. That look, the Nawab Arba'a, you would think I am the representative of the 12th Imam. Everyone has to come to me for hadiths. Not necessarily, And they never had such a claim. They never had such a claim that we're the ones you're supposed to come to for this. Kulaini doesn't run the book by them, so they go to Sahib al-Zaman for it either. You see that it just shows that there is a culture and a system in place already by the Imams. Those later Imams have done a good job of training their Shia to know what they're supposed to do now in these times of Ghaybat al-Sughra. So that's the first book, Al-Kafi. The second one is going to be Man la yahduruhu al-faqih. Yeah. So it's taking longer than I thought, so I don't know if I should continue with this or we should end. This one's going to be a long one too. Let's see what happens. Let's go through it. So, Man la yahduru al-faqih. Who is this? We said Shaykh Saduq, he died in 381 AH, right? This person has compiled 300 books, they say. He himself acknowledges 250, how much is it? We'll see, 250 something in his own introduction, he says this. So he has that many books, according to himself, when he's writing this book. And so you can tell that, okay, you can guess that there might have been more books that he compiled later. So he's the compiler of 300 books, but this is his magnum opus, the main work, Man la yahduruhu al-faqih. It's number 1 of his works, and that's why it's one of the 4 books of hadiths that we have, the main collections. For him, this one though, it's only comprised of fiqh hadiths. It's not like Al-Kafi that has, the other ones. Unfortunately, it would have been nice if we had more, but he has this one, although he has other books on kitab like Tawheed, he has a book like that on that, and other things that he's written. So we have stuff from him in other books, but this book of his, that's the main one, it's all fiqh. And so he also, like Al-Kulaini, he brings the ones that he believes are sahih, and he puts out the ones that he doesn't believe they're sahih. Because I'm saying this because when we get to At-Tusi, Tusi does things a little differently. He doesn't only bring the ones that are sahih according to him, he brings the conflicting ones. So this makes Al-Faqih a book of fatwas for As-Saduq, based on hadiths based on hadiths. So what does he do? You tell him, hey, is this thing tahir or najis? He'll bring you a hadith that gives you what he thinks, but he just brings the hadith. He doesn't bring his own verbiage. He doesn't explain things too much, okay? This is where, let me open a parenthesis. This is where some anti-Ijtihad, anti-Taqlid people, they argue against Ijtihad and Taqlid. Why? They say, what does a mujtahid do? A mujtahid writes his own book. He says, these are the mutahirat, these are the najasat, this is how you pray. They don't use the wording of the hadith. They don't bring the hadith itself. How dare you use words other than the words of the imams? And the reason why they'll argue, they say, look at Shaykh Saduq, for example. That's how they would do it in the past. If they want to give a fatwa, they bring the hadith that they say is reliable according to them. That's what they bring. Why? How dare you put aside the hadith of Ahlul Bayt and use things in your own wording? Okay? Parentheses closed. We'll have to discuss these, inshallah, when we get to Taqlid. But for now, we're looking at Ijtihad. So this Man La Yahdul Faqih, that is his book of fatwas, in a sense, and opinions. But he's bringing the hadiths in there. Now here, I read somewhere that they had explained, and it's pretty obvious, that he is the last one to use this methodology, though. After him, if you look at other books, no, you'll find that now slowly, these mujtahideen are bringing their own verbiage into the equation as well, which is interesting. Now, we'll look into that more in detail later. Now this one, unlike Al-Kafi, he doesn't bring the entire chain of narrators in the beginning of the hadith. He's like, why waste my time? I have a note, I have a usul, one of the usul that I'm writing off of. There's like 45 hadith that I want to bring from this notebook. Why do I have to repeat the chain of narrators for every single hadith that comes from this? 45 times I have to write the same chain of narrators. Why should I do that? You know what I'll do? I'll just write the last person that he says. For example, Hussein ibn Sa'id said that I heard Imam al-Sadiq say this. And then in the end of his book, he brings something called the Mashikha or the Mashikha, my sheikhs. He brings my sheikhs. Actually, that kind of sounds the same. Mashikha, my sheikhs. Okay? So my teachers, the ones that I got these hadiths from. He says, hey people, instead of me repeating 45 times who I got from, who got from Hussein ibn Sa'id, I'll just say I get from Hussein ibn Sa'id. And then later in the end of the book, in my Mashikha section, I will tell you who the chain and the links were between me and Hussein ibn Sa'id. So for example, if I am F is narrating from, what's before F? E. Who narrates from? D. Narrates from C. From B, from A. Okay? I don't want to mention this and repeat this 45 times in my book and make my book so thick. I'll just say, hey, A said this, but you're F. Fill the gaps. He said, I'll fill the gap in the end. So people, 45 times I narrated from A, from Hussein ibn Sa'id. Those 45 times that I narrated from him, this was my chain. I just didn't want to repeat it. He says it in the end. Mashikha. It's very efficient, actually. The only problem is 120, they say, of these ones, he hasn't given the chain for it later. But did he forget? How was it exactly? Of those individuals that he's narrated from, he hasn't filled in the blanks for us later, according to at least one of the statistics that I was looking at. Yeah? So if he's narrating from like 400 or 500 people, let's say, whatever, I don't know the number, 120 of them is going to be a problem for us. We don't know his chain to that person. Do you know what that means? That means that all of those hadiths that have one of those 120 in them, we can't use anymore. Can't use meaning they're not reliable and authentic. We can use them as supporting evidence, but we can't just rely on them because they become mursal. Remember this. If a hadith is mursal, that means it's just hanging on its own in the air. It's not connected to anywhere. When it's not connected, you can't rely on it anymore. The opposite of mursal is musnad. That means it has a sanad. When you don't bring it, when you don't bring the chain in your mashikha later, we can't follow that hadith anymore. Yeah. What are your sources though? The same like Al-Kulaini. He says, I used those notebooks, man. I used reliable sources, original sources, that raw material. So that's wonderful. How many hadiths? It's almost 6,000 hadiths. Around 4,000 of them are musnad, but because of the problem that I said, 2,000 of them are going to be mursal. So Kafi had about 16,000. They're all musnad to an extent, let's say. But here though, we don't have this. 2/3 or 1/3 of it is not going to be musnad. It's going to be mursal. Yeah. In addition to certain hadiths that they say he doesn't even mention the hadith. He just does naql bil ma'na, which means he just explains the hadith in his own words. He says there's a hadith that says this, but no, bring the actual wording. He doesn't do that. So that's also a little bit of an issue for some. Yes, brother. After Kulaini, yeah. He must have had, yes. Very good question. Very good question. Did Al-Kulaini have access to the same sources that As-Saduq had access to? I would say there's probably a major overlap. There's probably a major overlap, but there's also some things that he's going to bring that Kulaini is not going to bring. Why? Because Kulaini brings Sahih indahu, Saduq brings Sahih indahu. Kulaini brings the one that are Sahih in his eyes, Saduq is going to bring the ones that are Sahih in his eyes. And who knows, maybe one had access to other notebooks that this one didn't have, and so on, and vice versa. So yeah, how much overlap there is, when you look into the books, you'll find they'll say that this hadith is in Kafi, it's also in Istibsar, it's also in Tahdhib, it's also in Man La Yahduru al-Faqih. Okay? No. It's not like Kulaini has 16,000 hadiths, and then Saduq is like, you know what, let me also bring another 6,000 that you didn't bring. No, it's not like that. There will be overlap. All right, and so having said that, what does this Man La Yahduruhu al-Faqih even mean? Man La Yahduruhu al-Faqih means the one who doesn't have access to a faqih. This book was written once again as the result of a request that somebody had from Saduq. And this person, we'll read it really quickly and then we'll end, is telling Saduq that, Saduq, there's this cool book in our time, you can get it on Amazon. Well, actually, you have to go to the Amazon and get it probably. And this is called Man La Yahduruhu al-Tabib. The one who, and this was written by Zakaria Razi, okay, the famous physician of his time. That he has a book, Man La Yahduruhu al-Tabib, the one who doesn't have access to a doctor and a physician. This is a handbook that you can use. He says, can we have something similar to that? But not for the one who doesn't have a doctor, but the one who doesn't have a faqih. Man la yahduruhu al-faqih. Yahduruhu comes from huzur. Okay? You're not in the presence of a faqih. You don't have a faqih, but you have the handbook. Yeah? Can we do something like that? And so he says, yeah. So let's read that really quickly. This is in a book that is on alislam.org actually. It's in English. It's called Great Shi'i Works by Ian Keith Anderson Howard. So the only reason I brought it is because I couldn't find English translation anywhere else. I didn't want to translate the whole introduction myself, so I was like, let's just use this one. But it's there, and he's done a little bit of a talk. He talks about each of these main four books, from what I remember. Anyway, he says that Shaykh Saduq, in the introduction of his book, Man La Yahduru al-Faqih, expresses the motive that pushed him to write it, a part of which is adapted and rewritten recently based on the book, detailed, whatever. So anyway, they've restructured the introduction a little bit to make it more smooth, I guess. And so this is the story, brothers and sisters. It says, during a trip, Shaykh al-Saduq is saying this now. He says, during a trip, and by the way, there's a lot of details about the lives of these people like Saduq. Much more than Kulaini. We don't have as much with Kulaini, but Saduq and the trips he went on and the people that he would meet and the books that he would write and how he would do it is beautiful. How much painstaking of an effort these people put in to preserve the legacy of Ahlul Bayt for us today. SubhanAllah, I don't know how much thawab these people are getting. God knows. Anyway, he says, during a trip to the land of Balkh, by the grace of Allah the Almighty, I met a holy and pious person without equal and unique in his name. And this acquaintance will always bring me joy and honor and pride. At that time, I benefited from his company. So Saduq is saying, like, I was all lonely. I was gharib. I found somebody that was really good. And he says, because dialogue with him gave me a feeling of tranquility, joy, and glory. He was learned, pious, committed person, very much attached to the religion, born in a noble and dignified family, who were descendants of a virtuous ancestry. And with his excellent ethics and his valuable and commendable attributes, such as solemnity, modesty, dignity, chastity, and generosity, had multiplied his merits. He was a good person, but then he had even more fazail. This person was Abu Abdullah Muhammad bin Hassan bin Ishaq bin Hassan bin Hussein ibn Ishaq ibn Musa ibn Ja'far ibn Muhammad bin Ali ibn Hussein ibn Ali ibn Abi Talib. So he's a Sayyid, yeah, and he goes back to Imam al-Qadhim. Ishaq ibn Musa ibn Ja'far. So Imam Musa al-Qadhim's son, Ishaq, from that lineage, which is interesting. Today, people don't know their lineages 2, 3, 4, maybe going back, unless you're Sayyid maybe and you have a tree. But back then, they had these things. This family structure was valuable back then. Anyway, this descendant of Imam al-Qadhim, known as Sayyid Ni'mat. That's his name, Sayyid Ni'mat. So that's what we'll refer to him as going forward. One day, Sayyid Ni'mat told me, Muhammad bin Zakaria Razi, that famous Iranian, was he Iranian? He was Persian, right? Zakaria Razi. Persian physician, the famous physician, wrote a medical book for those who, when they need a doctor but can't find one, they use it. And has titled it "Man la yahduruhul tabib," meaning the one who doesn't have access to a doctor. And this book, despite its small volume, is complete, adequate, and sufficient in its subject, and very useful to everyone as much as they need it. He also asked me to write a book on jurisprudence, Islamic law, and religious precepts in a comprehensive and universal way that ensures the approval and trust of people. We need something like that, he said. And all they need in terms of jurisprudence, rules, sharia, lawful and unlawful issues, wajib, haram, and all these must be mentioned so that people can follow the instructions with reference to it. And all of them can read it and practice their religion according to its instructions, copy it and share it with others. You see, transcribe it, circulate it. And they will all be associated in its divine reward. Sayyid Ni'mat expressed these remarks at that moment, that he himself had full knowledge of all the books I had written up to that time, which numbered around 245 volumes. So Saduq is saying, Sayyid Ni'mat is asking me for a book, although he knows I've written 245 already. By the way, unfortunately, out of these 245, I think like about maybe 15, 17 of them, something like that, 12 of them, I don't remember the exact number. That's all we have from hundreds of books. And so, brothers and sisters, this shows us the persecution that the Shia have always been under, right? Whether we like it or not, these books, if we were a free people over the centuries, we would have freely been able to transcribe these books, give them out, and have others transcribe them. But no, they were all lost eventually because there was such a limited amount of manuscripts of them. So out of those hundreds, only this many has remained. 10, 15, something like that. Of which he had copied the majority, which he himself had heard directly of me. So Saduq reads his books to Sayyid Ni'mat. Majority of them, he says. And he transcribes. God knows how much time these people have put. Even though Sayyid Ni'mat knows of all the books, has a copy of all my books, and I've read them to him, yeah. Now we just copy paste PDFs to each other. See how easy it's become, really? And then there's no excuse for us not to have knowledge anymore. I don't know. This is how they would do it. He says, despite knowing all of this, he still asks me for a book like this. Despite everything, the feeling of the need to write such a book in jurisprudence existed, and his speech reminded me of it. I, too, because I knew him well, and I considered him a competent and qualified person, and I also felt the need to write such a book, and moreover, I saw his request to write such a book appropriate, accepted his proposal. So he wrote this book as a result of that proposal. Man la yahduruhul faqih, which shows that al-kafi might not have been enough for a lot of people to get their answers. Yeah, man la yahdurul faqih might have a different style and approach in things versus al-kafi. Yeah. Anyway, that's one of the main books that we have, and there will be hadiths in here that al-kafi does not bring as well. So we have two more books though left from those two are from At-Tusi. We'll leave those inshallah for another time. Any questions before we end? Yes. Well, Saduq, it's hard to say like where he was residing towards the later years of his life because he was traveling. From my understanding, he was traveling to a lot of different cities, and so yeah. But before that, no, his father is from Qom, right next to the Haram of Bibi Masuma. There's a grave there, and then he himself, I think he was towards Ray and stuff, if I'm not mistaken, initially. But then he moved out and he started going places more and more. Yeah, Kulaini also is from it's from the outskirts of Ray. Kulain is a city on the outskirts of Ray. Yeah. So Kulaini is from that area, but then he ended up, of course, in Baghdad. He's buried in Baghdad. Yeah, yeah. That's where the Nawab are as well. Yeah. Yeah. I have a very bad memory with the places and dates and history and all that. From what I remember, that Saduq was also in Ray, but then of course he was in Qom, but then he went to Ray, and I think he studied there a little bit after he studied under his father. It's interesting. Saduq, actually, in one of his books, in his introduction, he says, I am the result of the dua of Imam Zaman, actually. That Imam Zaman wrote a letter to his father, and he did dua. He told him, you're going to have a son. He's going to be a scholar, or teach him. And so his first teacher was his father. And he was born through the dua of Imam Zaman, according to himself. And then after that, he moves to Ray and stuff. And then after that, he goes to a lot of places. I'll double check that to make sure. Yeah, but that's what I remember. Okay, so that leaves us with tahdib and istibsar, and we'll leave that for our next session. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalamu